After our conversation and after I answer your questions, we're going to do a couple things. We're going to give away some prizes. So here's the prizes we have. So first of all, welcome everybody that's on with us. So here's the prizes we're going to give away. No matter where you are, if you tell Scott you're here and you want to be in the drawing, so let him know. So the first drawing and the first prize is for a church and their security team, up to 10 members, to get a free 4-hour virtual training session, critical skills training session from me. And that's absolutely free. We'll do that through Zoom. So something we're testing out. So if you want to be part of that, you want to register, then let Scott know now. Just tell him where you're from, who you are, what church, and then he's going to actually draw and pick that after this is over. So again, we'll get that schedule for you. We'll give you the topics, but it's a CST or critical skills training session, and that deals with threat identification, post-standing procedures, actually talking to people, equipment requirements, that kind of stuff. Then what we're going to do is we're going to give away, and so let Scott know if you want this also, no matter where you are, we're going to give away 2 church security individual basic kits. And if you watch some of our other stuff, you understand that the basic church security kit has a Streamlight micro light in it. So you're going to get this. You're going to get a SWAT T tourniquet to stop that bleeding or control it. You're going to get a CPR barrier so you can help start the breathing in rescue breaths as you're giving CPR. And then you're also going to get a rescue blanket. And that is obviously to help treat shock if somebody's bleeding, or if you're treating someone with hypothermia, or maybe you just keep it with you and you're in a bad accident, or you get stranded and it gets cold, you cover yourself up. All this stuff will go in your pocket. And so we're going to give away 2 of these church security kits. And if you get in the drawing for that, we're going to just send these kits to wherever you want us to send them to. So we'll put them in an envelope, send them to you. And then if you're in Middle Tennessee, let Scott know. And we're going to give away 5 range passes to the Armory, to either the Franklin or the Nashville location. So if you're in the Middle Tennessee area and you can drive to the Armory, which is a nice indoor range here, there's 2 locations, one just in Nashville outside Brentwood, and then one south here in Franklin, we're going to give you those passes. So 5 drawings for folks in Middle Tennessee, for 1 pass each for a $20 range session, 2 church security individual kits, and then we're going to get that virtual training for a church security team. All right. So again, thanks for joining us, and we're going to go ahead and get started. We're just going to have a conversation. As Kent and I start to talk, at some point I'll take a break, and then I'll start to take questions from Scott. Kent, welcome, man. Thanks for coming up and visiting with us tonight, and being willing to talk about church security and have this conversation with the folks out there in Facebook land.
Happy to be here, and happy that everybody's joined us tonight. Hopefully this will be... I'll ask some good questions, and this will be informative. So, Michael, let's start off. I always find it interesting to kick things off with a bit of discussion about what you've really hammered home in the training that you've provided me, which is the difference between reaction and prevention, and how that difference, why that's important, and how that impacts the approach to church security specifically in terms of day-to-day mindset and strategy, and how you think about things as you're trying to look out for the church and the folks that are there.
Yeah, good question. So folks that are listening or watching, if you guys have watched some of our other stuff, you've heard this before, but this is a good topic to talk about, especially if you've not listened to our stuff or tuned in before. So, really there's a difference. So I'll talk about both of them, response, number one, or reaction, and then, of course, you brought up prevention. So if we've talked about, I don't know, probably 100 times, response or reaction, or we're just talking about response, is the actions that someone has to take to stop something. And in our case, when we start to talk about physical protection, that means to stop an attack, stop something that we have to respond to. And so what that means is I'm actually having to, once something happens, I get 3 things. Number one, I get some kind of communication or notification that's happening. I have to get there. And then once I get there, I got to solve the problem. Okay? So most of the time we start talking about response, we think about things like like the police or fire and EMS. And so there's not anything wrong with response. The actions we take to stop that problem. The problem is that's very, very reactive. And so in physical protection, even in the church environment, we want to prevent something from happening. And so what that means is we stop something before it even occurs. And so, one, reaction, we're having to go to something, and we're always behind the curve because we have to get notification, we have to get there, and then we have to stop it. Prevention stops that thing from happening before it ever happens. And the cool thing, and that happens with that's really the objective of any security program. But in the church security world, that's really, really a good thing because that really fits in to what our mission is. And that is to prevent things, to prevent those bad things from happening. And in the church, if we're preventing, stopping, that means we're out there on post, we're seeing it early, and it never really happens. And we do that in a very nice, calm way, and it fits in with the mission and the culture of the church. So those are the two differences, and that's why it's important, because it really fits into our job as church protectors.
And so and I know that when you start talking about prevention, there's there's no foolproof way. You can't control the actions of others, and you can't control every contingency. And this gets to be, I guess, for a lot of people, potentially the dry aspect to physical protection. But in private business, it's certainly important. I think it's important at the church as well. What you're really talking about is risk mitigation or risk management. It's a risk management program. And so you've got, I think of that in terms of the probability of something occurring, right?
Yep.
And then the severity of the event. And so when you're talking about church security, talk a little bit about the probability and the severity aspect of this, and what you have to consider if you're setting up a church security program, kind of how you approach that, because I think a lot of people are really tempted to focus on maybe some things that do have an awful severity. It's a terrible event that can occur, but the probability may be really low. And so talk a little bit about how you approach that and what you recommend as you're looking at those factors and you're setting it up on the front end.
Yeah, so and I hope we've got some folks that don't know the answer to this question. You're looking at it now and asking that very question because you've got limited resources and you don't have all the money in the world to spend to deal with everything that might happen. So very first thing is we go in to develop. The world I came from is called threat spectrum. So what it is you're trying to defend the church against, and defend's probably a strong word, but all the things that could possibly or probably happen, right, in some case. And so when you start to look at that, we look at a couple things like what's happened to other churches, what's happened on site at our church, what have we had to deal with before, what are we not doing, so like a vulnerability piece, and then kind of what's going on around the area where we are. And so so when we start identifying those pieces on those very specific hazards or threats, then we do start to look at, to your point, this issue of probability. Like, what's the likelihood of that thing happening, number one, and that does go back to, has it happened before, what are you not doing, what's going on in the area, and what's every other church doing and what's happening to these other churches. And then, of course, again, a part of this risk management piece is, the severity. What does that mean? And so most of the time when we talk about this, we talk about the active shooter.
Right.
And so, and that's always, something that gets everybody's attention. So in this case, let's just say we've identified the active shooter as something that is probable. Now, the probability of that's really, really low. And so we've talked about this before. You can go to our other videos and you can see that probability of an active shooter at a church is very, very low based on the number of churches in the U.S. And number two, the times that it actually does happen, especially in the last 20 years, like 14 times. We're talking about somebody that plans an event, comes in purposely to murder people, to murder a large group of folks. So can that happen? Is it likely that's going to happen? Well, it can. But that likelihood is very low. But the severity or the consequence of that is very, very high. Sandy Hook Elementary is a perfect example of that. They had to tear Sandy Hook Elementary. It's not a church, but they had to tear that school completely down because they could not deal with the severity or the consequence of that event. And so So we look at when we look at those incidents on a threat spectrum of those hazards, we want to look at, hey, what's the likelihood of this happening? Number one, and number two, what's the consequence if it does? And we look at that whether it's an active shooter or, like you and I have learned over the last 5 years. Look, the most likely thing is probably going to be somebody slipping or falling, as they walk in, or somebody having chest pains.
A medical event.
Yeah, a medical event. So again, that's very severe. Something like that happens, we need to be there to deal with it. But the likelihood of that is much higher than the active shooter event or the act of violence.
Well, and the other aspect, when you're thinking about these issues and when you're setting up a security program for a church, obviously, as you've touched on, there are issues beyond the active shooter that you need to consider. You need to consider medical events and sort of what I would classify as safety prevention, prevent the slip and falls and to be available. But the other thing that you really start to look at are the steps you take and the impact of those steps when you're designing that security program. Why don't we just, in balancing that against the mission of the church, let's talk a little bit about that, because at one extreme you could simply lock the church down, wand everybody that's coming in, search every bag, have a very visible, armed, uniformed presence at the church. All of those things would be deterrents to an active shooter. What's the downside of that approach?
Yeah, and so
besides resources, obviously, having available resources is one, and limited resources. But beyond that, talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, and I'll answer this, and then we'll take some questions.
Okay.
I see both approaches, and obviously we're on the other side, and can we lock down the church? Can we lock the doors? Can we put cameras up? Can we put armed people outside with open carry? Can we put people in uniforms? Absolutely, we can do that. Can that provide a deterrence, or by definition, convince the adversary that our physical protection system is too tough to defeat? We can do that. The problem with that is, number one, the mission of the main problem with that is the mission of the church is to make everybody feel welcome. No matter who they are, no matter what color they are, no matter where they're from, no matter what clothes they're wearing, the mission of the church, of the Christian church in the United States of America, or anywhere in the world, the mission of Jesus Christ is to welcome everybody inside and get them in there so they can hear the good word and to save them. And so if we're locking the doors, if we're putting cameras up, if we put scary people outside, if we have weapons that can be observed, and we make people feel as if they're coming inside of a Federal Reserve bank, then it's not going to make them number one, it won't make them feel very welcome. And number two, I do not believe that is the way that church security programs are supposed to be designed, because when we look at physical security design, and we've talked about this again 100 times, the most important element for us is going to be that conflict avoidance. And what that means is that we are avoiding any conflict with the organization we're protecting. And for a church, doing that conflicts, in my opinion, with the very mission. Because what we're doing is we're shutting off every entrance, every exit. We're telling people they have to do very specific things. And I wouldn't like that. If I pull up to a church and there's a guy out there with weapons, and there's a lot of police and there's cameras, and then they're turning people around and searching backpacks and all the things that we look at the world that the way that's the world treats security or implements security, it's very different the way we should probably do that, and it conflicts with the overall mission.
And there's consequences and cost to those steps.
Absolutely.
So you got to balance all of that.
Absolutely.
And use good judgment about that.
Absolutely. And the consequence is people don't want to show up.
It's early in my career in credit risk analysis, I was told you can be the smartest guy in the room in terms of mitigating risk, but you may also be the loneliest. And so you've got to you got to balance that and continue to be able to do business. And so I think that concept applies here. We've got to welcome people and be a welcoming institution, in addition to figuring out ways to stay safe. And I think what you would say is you can do both. It is possible to do both of those things. It's not an either-or proposition.
Absolutely, and it's a must. Scott, do we have any questions as we continue our discussion here?
Well, Michael, I'm glad you asked. We do have a question from our friend Jim over in Georgia. He says, nobody ever talks about ammunition in the worship center. What do you recommend?
no one talks about ammunition in the worship center?
Yeah, and what type of ammunition or things like that?
Okay, so like what type of ammunition the security team would carry? Okay, so it's a good question, Jim. And so so ammunition, what does that mean? So why don't people talk about that? So I'm not. Let me just say this: there's no such thing as a magic bullet, and I'm not saying don't pay attention to the ammunition you carry. But that's probably it's probably one of the latter things that we're going to worry about. But I'll answer the question and probably just give you an idea of what to think about with ammunition, because we don't sell ammunition. I don't push any products, and so. But when we think about ammunition, we're talking about handguns. I'm assuming is what Jim's asking. Here's some things to think about with ammunition. And so if we're talking about pistols, because it needs to be concealed, there's a couple things. When we start to talk about ammunition and the importance of it, the purpose of that ammunition is to stop a threat. So what we're talking about is penetrating a target. So some things to think about, Jim, when you're looking at ammo and what ammo to buy. Number one, when we start to think about penetration, stopping the threat, we're thinking about the weight, so the grain. All right. We think about the velocity of the speed. We think about the shape, and then we think about the diameter or the caliber, right? And so just some things to consider. The bigger the caliber, the harder it can be to control that recoil, and a lot of times the bigger the caliber, it's going to be slower. And so cool thing about big calibers, if you hit the target, obviously, the wound cavity could be bigger, but of course it's slower. And so all kinds of things to think about. But here's what I would suggest. If you take a look at, there's a report that the FBI puts out every couple of years about ammunition and performance. If you pay attention to those reports, a couple of things that report kind of highlights and some things to think about. So something that's a little bit smaller that travels faster. We talk about velocity. So something I like is some of the 9mm hollow point. Number one, it is quick, or it is fast, and so we want that speed so it's able to actually penetrate. Number two, the purpose of the hollow point, when it does hit, it starts to expand, and so when that expansion does happen, it does, potentially make a bigger wound cavity, and so it hopefully would reach something. If we're accurate with our shots, it's going to reach something that's vital, that's important for the body to continue functioning. So just some things to look at is, again, the weight, that's the grain. So like 230 grain or 124 grain, whatever. You're looking at the velocity of the speed itself. You look at the caliber, and you look at the shape and some other things. So here's what I would stay away from. Stay away from any kind of ball ammunition. Ball ammunition's for the range. I would look at hollow point, and then I would study that ammunition very specifically on penetration.
Excellent. So we have another question. You'll Perry.
Yeah.
So Perry is asking, So this is mindset. So how can a team of non-professionals, so you're thinking volunteer team, folks that don't do this professionally and maybe only there on Sundays or every other Sunday, how can they continue to maintain a prudent, prepared, preventative mindset?
Yep. So first thing, Perry, and we've talked about this. So number one, on this, the most important thing we start talking about, kind of the difference between church security and security in the world is, one, the most important thing at that church ministry or that security ministry is going to be a servant's heart. So the people that you're choosing to be on your team or your ministry must want to serve. And I know that sounds silly because you think, well, people volunteer, of course they want to serve. Well, as soon as they start standing post and it's 95 degrees, like if you're here in the South, and Tennessee, Georgia, Mississippi, wherever, 95-degree weather, it starts to get hot. Motivation starts to wear off very, very quickly. Or if you're in some place like Wisconsin and you've got a post outside and it's 15 degrees and you're going to have to stand outside on that post, that motivation starts to wear. So number one, for ministries, make sure as you choose or select your team members or your members of that ministry, they want to serve the church and serve Jesus Christ. And so, one, that's going to solve a lot of your problems. That's the difference between security in the world where somebody's getting paid in the church. Two, to stay sharp, some sort of initial training that's going to set them up for success. And that's not necessarily gun training. We're talking about understanding your mission. So the training that you receive should, number one, tell you what the mission is, why you're there. And that is, again, like any other ministry, to spread the word of Jesus Christ and the good news and to welcome everybody in the church. Number 2, situational awareness. So, how to be aware. What does that mean? And so Perry, you brought that up. How does somebody stay alert? So talk about what that means and how to do that. That's part of the training. The next part of the training would be what it is that they're looking for. Because there are very specific things that you're going to look for in protection. And then the next thing is how to address that issue if you see it, and address it as you would as a church ministry team member, not as a TSA agent in an airport. And so again, servants' hearts, and then receive some initial training that goes over those very critical elements, and that's what we're going to give away to somebody tonight. Somebody's going to get a 4-hour training session on just what I talked about. So I think that's the elements. Number 1, servants' heart's going to keep them sharp, and then if they receive really or decent training about the mission, what it is they're looking for, how to respond to it, and really what situational awareness and mindset is.
Excellent. Next question is from Greg up at Fairview Church in Lebanon. He wants to know, what are your recommendations on assessing vulnerabilities? And then a second part of that question would be, what's your favorite site for historical data on local crimes?
Yep. Okay. So let me answer. Let's talk about vulnerability. So Greg's asking about how we assess vulnerability. So a vulnerability is it's a site or a system weakness. It's something that we are not doing. And so easiest way to do a quick VA or vulnerability assessment of your facility is, number 1, try to figure out what you're trying to protect the church from. The threat spectrum that we talked about. And again, it's not necessarily the active shooter. It could be a medical emergency. So number 1, find out those elements or those hazards you're trying to protect the church from, and then go back with your team or with you can do this with a security professional, somebody that helps. Then go back and look to see, after you've figured out what those hazards are, what equipment do you have and what are you currently doing to deal with that issue? And so whatever it is you're not doing, figure that out, and then go back and figure out how to solve the problem. So what is the problem, number 1? And number 2, what are you currently doing to address it? And that is really a vulnerability assessment. What are we trying to protect the church from, number 1? And number 2, where do we lack? Where do we have a system weakness? So figure out what those problems are, and then go back and figure out what it is you're not doing. A great example is going to be, I've got a church of 100 people, and everybody or 90% of the congregation is 50 plus. Well, gun violence is not the largest killer of Americans. The largest killer of Americans in the United States is heart disease. So if I've got the majority of my congregation is 50 plus, and I don't have an AED or I don't have my church members certified in CPR, that's a vulnerability and we need to fix it. Second question was favorite sites for crime. Here's what I would do. If you are a local church, the easiest way to do this, because when you get online and try to start using online tools, some of them you try to charge money, and some of them it's really hard to get down into the guts of the report. So here's what I would do. I don't depend on law enforcement very much, and the reason for that is they have a job that's very different than ours in protection. But I would say if you want to know what crime is going on in your city, your county, your area, then I would go to your local sheriff's department if you're in the county, or I would go to the city police department, and they have resources that they pay for, that they get, or that they have. It's information they collect for things that they have to report out every year. They actually collect that information, and they can give that information to you, and most of the time it's absolutely free. That is the easiest way to gather crime data. So for you, Greg, it's going to be Wilson County Sheriff's Office.
Michael, I've got a question. You mentioned law enforcement. When someone is setting up a church security program, or maybe they've got an existing one, but they want to shore this aspect up, we want to support and work in concert with those local law enforcement and EMS in the event they arrive on scene. To what extent do you need to notify law enforcement and or local authorities that you've got a church security team and do any pre-planning with them? Is any of that necessary on the front end, and how much communication should you be doing at a church in that regard?
It's always good. It's not something that you have to do. It's a good question. You don't have to do that. It would be a good idea. So we want to make friends. For 2 reasons. it's always a good idea to bring the local police in, the responders, and do let them know, hey, we just want you to know, hey, we probably don't need anything from you, but we have a security team. And in the case of a response, when you guys respond, when we call you, these are the group of folks who are going to be here responding. Get to know them, and I'd even set it up to where when you do that, you might have lunch for them, or you might have coffee or something set up for them when they come. Because if you tell them there's food, somebody in law enforcement is probably going to show up. Number one, and two, it makes them feel more relaxed. And so, two reasons for doing that. One, so they do understand what you have in place. And then when they show up, a lot of times they may offer to help you in some way, and you can take that help, or you can not take it. And then two, what that does also is that opens the door for them, without them really knowing it, that you're welcoming them into the church, and having a relationship with the local police again. Might open a door for them and open a door for you guys where, hey, some of those guys come in or some of those gals come in and they decide to come worship. And so it's a good idea to make friends, especially if you got food and beverages there for them. Because a lot of times they have to pay for their food when they're working, and so it's a nice gesture for us to provide that for them. Two, again, so they see who would be responding and they understand what your plan is. And then three, you might open the door for somebody to come in and worship. So it's not something that you got to do, but it would be nice to do it, especially if you need some resources. Most of the time when you call them and you ask them to come out, a lot of times they'll offer stuff for free. And so don't ever turn down anything that's free. Right?
As folks out there considering this, is a law enforcement background necessary in order to serve the church in a security capacity? Do you need that law enforcement background to show up and serve your church on their security team? Absolutely not.
And so I will. We have a big team. We manage a team of almost 60 men. We've had women on the team throughout the last 5 years, and of course, like any ministry, people come on and then they leave the team, and so we have a rotation. We don't have much of a turnover, but we do have some. But none of our I think that we might have one person that's on the team that had some correctional officer experience or some reserve law enforcement experience or something like that. But so the answer to your question is absolutely not. In fact, if it's my choice, and what I always prefer is that they don't have any experience from me, because we provide the training for them. I like someone that doesn't have any experience in law enforcement. And the reason for that is a lot of times when you bring a law enforcement professional into a security environment, they want to respond because that's their job. They answer calls all day long. They respond to things, and the security professional's job is actually to prevent. And so a lot of times it's very difficult to teach a police officer, a former police officer, how to prevent something, because it's boring. Like, you're standing there, you're watching, you kind of have to validate things before you go up and respond to something. So absolutely not, it's not necessary. In fact, I prefer that experience is not there, not because we don't want police officers, but because in my professional experience, I've been doing this for a very long time, designing security programs. When you bring law enforcement veterans into security, sometimes it's very tough to get them to understand what prevention means and just how to do that. And so, and sometimes, sometimes they don't like to do that. They because they've been trained to respond so much. So it is not necessary. And my preference has always been that we just train regular folks, people with a servant's heart.
Without getting into a big debate about it, do you have to have an armed component to your security program in order to mitigate risk?
No, you do not. I would tell you that guns do not. So our job is prevention, and guns don't prevent the active shooter. They don't prevent violence. The gun is a tool of response only. It doesn't prevent anything. And so anybody listening, there is no requirement for a church to be armed to protect the church. Protection or our prevention piece comes from gathering information or intelligence and deterrence, or that ability for us to convince the adversary that our target's going to be too hard to attack, and that's not done through guns. That's actually done through situational awareness, standing post, and out there looking for something before it actually happens. So no, guns are not a requirement to protect the church. They're required to respond to some things, but not to protect.
If you are going to equip a security team, or you are going to have a security team that's going to have an armed component for response, in your opinion, give the folks out there, what's some minimum threshold of training or qualification that you deem necessary in order to do that and do that safely?
Yeah. So after they've gone through a background investigation, like all volunteers on any ministry, after they've been vetted through over your process, that first training should be orientation into, and even if they're members of the church and believers, and they've been there, a mission of what, the mission of the team or the ministry itself, number one. So involves what the ministry is, what that mission is, and what that means. Second is
including the expectations of service as well, right? What the commitment means.
Absolutely. So what does it mean? What do I have to do this? And how long do you expect me to do this? And that sounds like a bad way of presenting that, but again, there should be expectations when we start talking about volunteer ministries. And so the mission and then those expectations. I think the next element's going to be situational awareness, like how to stand post, what they're looking for, how to stand sharp on, stay sharp on post. When it's 95 degrees outside, what do you do to, keep yourself from having heat exhaustion, and what does that mean? Another element would be, again, we've talked about it, what are you looking for? What are you looking for out there? What are some indicators of a problem? And then if you see those indicators, what steps do you have to go through to actually respond to that or deal with that problem or question or validate whether or not that is an issue? And then I think the next big piece is really going to be medical response. And I don't mean it's not a doctor. It's a couple hours of training, and that is basic first aid, CPR, how to use an AED. As silly as it sounds, there are a lot of people, as we do training, there are a lot of people, when you bring out a real AED, people get intimidated just to turn an AED on. And when we give training and show them how to do that, and they see how easy it is, then that fear or that anxiety goes away. But that next piece should be, how to use what CPR is, how to give rescue breaths, chest compressions, how to turn the AED on and use it, how to use a barrier, how to treat somebody into shock, how to stop the, bleeding, stop it. Yeah, stop the bleed or, bleeding control. So some very basic first aid, CPR, and start the breathing training. And so I think that is a base. That should be the base of any training program.
And you and I have talked a lot. A lot of these skills are perishable.
Yep.
And they require you to practice.
Yep.
And continue to hone those skills. And I find, for me personally, one of the most difficult things to practice is just the aspect of watching people, observing behavior, identifying behavior that's outside of the norm, and then obviously the training you provide in terms of then what do you do when you see that. Anything you want to tell the audience just about, because I find that very difficult to practice. Firearms, you've got dry fire training, you can go to the range. There's a lot of very practical things you can do in order to do that. That's one that's a softer skill and is more difficult to practice. Anything you got as it relates to that?
Yeah, it gets into the training piece. You've had ours, really. You've had, obviously you're on the team, you manage an aspect of that, and so a big piece of how to actually successfully stand post and look for those threats. One is, learning techniques of observation. So that is how to scan an immediate area, identifying your areas of responsibility, what that looks like to actually look inside that area of responsibility, and then identifying what you're looking for. And as you know, most of the time what we're looking for and what we see are two different things, right? So what it is we're looking for and what we think we see or what we're observing actually is probably not what it is we're looking for. And so there's a process that you've been taught that we go through with that. And so part of that's going to be, number one, what group is that with that person or that activity in? Does that look like something that we've been taught is something bad, like surveillance or rehearsing an attack? Does what other actions? What other behaviors? What what items does a person have with them? What is that stuff there? So it really is, number one, knowing what you're looking for, understanding those techniques of observation in your area of responsibility, and staying there, because it's very tough to stay in a very specific area and watch it for an hour and a half to 2 hours. Then knowing what you're looking for, and then understanding that validation process. And as you know, our validation process takes 3 or 4 steps. Even if we see something that we think is bad, like maybe surveillance, there's a process that we have to go through first. We're asking a number of questions. And if you do that, if you're doing that every Sunday, before you know it, you know because you're doing it, before you know it, the shift is over like that. If you look and you see something that you think is suspicious, the behavior itself, and you start going through that validation process you've been taught, time goes pretty quickly, does it not?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So it is. It's something you have to be trained to do, and it is very difficult. And it's difficult to explain in this form, but it is. It's going through the process of looking for it and then going through that validation process.
Well, I ask about that because I feel like when we talk about prevention, that's one of the more important aspects of
Yeah.
this is those soft skills.
Yep.
And being able to observe and then interact with people and ask the right questions.
Yep.
And understanding how to deal with that. That's one of the tougher things to wrap your head around, and why you need that training.
Absolutely.
Last question, it came up, I asked this because someone asked a question about ammo in the sanctuary. Talk a little bit about, we talk about this a lot, but talk a little bit about the notion of response, specifically the response piece inside the church versus outside the church, and kind of what that looks like, and why, from a prevention perspective, you're so big on you got to be outside and observing the church at the first point where people are starting to come in.
Yeah, so we hopefully won't have to do it, but we provide an immediate response. 2 types of responses. There's the immediate response, which means someone is there on site to respond, and then there's that delayed response or off-site response, and that's usually calling the police, because they can't be everywhere at once, and so there's always a delay of those folks to get there. And then there's that response process they have to go through. And so if we have to respond, the reason why it's important to see something outside. So the idea of physical security is we see a compromise, or we see something that's going to actually compromise what we're trying to protect, as far away from that thing that we're trying to protect as possible. So what that means is I want to see it outside. So if I believe that someone has a weapon, or I believe there's suspicious activity, or somebody's concealing something, or somebody's going to do something bad, I want to see it in the parking lot, because if I do have to respond and deadly force is authorized and I have to use it, I want to use that outside. Number one, hopefully, because everybody's inside when it happens, or the majority of people are already inside. And 2, if it happens on the inside, then there's number one, a much higher probability that other people are going to get hurt assets. They're going to be compromised. And number 2, that's going to increase the consequence of the event in general. So the reason we're trying to prevent it, and I keep talking about outside and concentric rings, is we want to see it outside, we want to stop it outside. That lessens number one, the probability of it happening, and number 2, it's also going to lessen the consequence to everybody, not only to the assets, but also to us.
It also provides the opportunity for a member of the security team to pick up on that behavior, maybe during surveillance or a rehearsal.
Absolutely.
As opposed to the real thing.
Absolutely. And again, we go through that validation process. Is that what I think it is?
Right.
Scott, I know you've got some folks that have registered, so let's go real quick. Who won the free virtual training? Who did that?
So congratulations to Trenton from the River of Life Church in Jacksonville, North Carolina.
Outstanding. Okay. Do we know how many team members he has?
I didn't ask that question, but I'll see if I can get that before we wrap up.
Excellent. So we'll Trenton, is that his first name?
Trenton, yeah.
Okay, Trenton, Jacksonville, North Carolina?
Jacksonville, North Carolina.
No
I was
way.
surprised. I didn't even know there was a Jacksonville.
Well, yeah, that's Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. I'm a Marine Corps veteran. Everybody knows about Jacksonville, North Carolina. That is the home of Camp Lejeune.
Well, there you go.
So, all right. So, Trenton, congratulations. Hey, Scott is going to get with you, and we will set up a time to do this virtual Zoom training for you, and so we can get that delivered to you. And again, congrats. You're going to love it. It's about 4 hours. Okay. All right. We've got some range passes for some folks in Middle Tennessee. Who's the winner of one of those range passes?
Those are going to go to our good friends Perry and Greg.
Outstanding. So Perry and Greg have won range passes. They're in Middle Tennessee. So we're going to pass those passes out to them. Do we have anything else to give away?
So we've got the kits, and I'm going to kind of maybe call an audible here. Let's mail these kits to Dan, who is in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, with Sedge Garden Baptist Church. We can mail him one.
Okay.
And then we have our Man Mile Award going to Mike from, I think it's Wasco, California. He's like 1,000 miles away,
Yeah, no
10,000 miles away or something. He's with New Generation Church in Wasco, California. So we'll mail some things out there. With COVID, it might take a month or two to get there, but we'll send it anyway.
Yeah. So what was her names again? We're going to
So Dan in Sedge Garden Baptist Church out of Winston-Salem, North Carolina.
Okay.
And then Mike from New Generation Church in Wasco, California.
Perfect. All right, so Dan and Mike, here's what you're going to get real quick. You're going to get a SWAT T tourniquet. You're going to get a Streamlight micro stream flashlight. Very nice. Handheld, or it fits in your pocket. There's even a little lanyard back here with it. You're going to get a CPR barrier that fits in your pocket on your keychain, and you're also going to get an emergency blanket. So again, you're going to control the bleeding, help that person if they're in shock, and then, of course, rescue breaths if required in CPR, so the barrier so you don't get COVID-19. Maybe. It might go through the barrier. Who knows? Because it's so deadly. And a flashlight. All right, and these are really cool flashlights. So congrats. We're going to get your addresses. So everybody that we're going to mail something to, Scott's going to get your information. We're going to mail those directly to you. So congrats again. Our friend in Jacksonville, North Carolina, Ura. We're going to provide that virtual training for you, and then we've got some range passes for our folks in here in Middle Tennessee. All right, I think that's it. We were doing about 41 minutes here, so we want to cut it off. Hey, thanks everybody for joining us. Go to our website at michaelmannsecurityservices.com. We've got some really cool videos up. We've got a bunch of training coming up in Middle Tennessee. We're working on pushing out some of this webinar training, so one of our test cases is going to be our friend in Jacksonville. We're going to get some feedback from them. You can always email us and ask us a question on our Facebook page at Safe with Man. Normally we respond usually within the hour. Or you can email us at ScottM, SCOTTM, at michaelmannsecurityservices.com. Or you can call Scott. I can't remember his phone number off the top of my head because it just says Scott Mousby on my phone. But I think his phone number is on the website. You can call him at 6 a.m., 6 p.m., or 2 a.m. He's going to answer the phone, and his wife and kids will love that. All right? Hey, thanks for tuning in, folks. We really appreciate it. Congrats to the winners of the prizes. Everybody go to our webpage, especially if you're in Middle Tennessee. We got a bunch of good training coming up. Register for that. And remember, everybody, please, it is about prevention and not response. Thanks again, folks.